Verify ready for launch. FTS.
FTS go.
Props go. ABI.
ABI's go.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Good afternoon and welcome to our webcast for the Transporter 14 mission. Falcon 9 is currently scheduled to lift off in just under 10 minutes from now from Space Launch Complex 4 East at Vandenberg Space Force Base, which is just a few hours north from us here in Hawthorne, California. My name is Jesse Anderson and I'm a Senior Production and Engineering Manager here at SpaceX.
And I'm Tyler Lionquist, an analyst for Starlink. Today we are sending 70 payloads to orbit, including CubeSats, microsats, re-entry capsules, and orbital transfer vehicles, carrying 3 of those payloads to be deployed at a later time. One of those payloads we're delivering to orbit today is called Mission Possible, the exploration company's second space capsule prototype. The capsule will carry 25 client payloads into orbit and perform a controlled atmospheric re-entry and splashdown. All spacecraft on board today will separate from the second stage across 66 deployment events, scheduled to start around T plus 54 minutes and conclude about 2 hours and 43 minutes after liftoff.
SpaceX has launched more than 1,200 payloads to orbit for more than 130 customers across our entire rideshare program. This launch marks our 17th dedicated smallsat rideshare program launch between our transporter and bandwagon missions. If you're interested, we have a full list of payloads for today's mission available on spacex.com/launches.
We are currently working toward a liftoff of 2:25 p.m. Pacific Time. If needed, there is a backup launch opportunity tomorrow at 2:18 p.m. Pacific Time. But right now, the weather is currently green on the Central Coast and the range is ready to support. While the countdown continues, let's take a moment to learn a bit more about the Mission Possible payload flying today.
It is in our nature to explore, the fabric of our existence built on a desire to understand, to discover, to expand our boundaries, to explore the unknown, to learn from those that came before, and do better for those that come after. When we endeavour, we do it together. Our most grand of expeditions, the result of values shared and pioneering skills oft unexpectedly paired. Together, explorers don't just dream of it, we do it. And we, the engineers, designers, developers, dreamers, and doers of the exploration company, we are explorers. And together, we know no bounds. The world's first capsule privately funded. We take off from any heavy launcher in the world. So we're not racing to space, but cooperating on building a frontier. And this capsule is just the beginning. There will be new vehicles, new discoveries, new technologies, new ways to make space for everyone. At the Exploration Company, we build accessible, sustainable, and cooperative space worlds.
The Falcon 9 rocket supporting today's mission is a 2-stage rocket designed for reliable and safe transportation of satellites, cargo, and people. Starting from the very top of the vehicle, we have
Stage
the
1 RPM
payload.
load is complete.
We have the payload fairing, which might be a little foggy there in Vandenberg, but the payload fairing is a protective shell that houses all the payloads, shielding them from aerodynamic heating until the vehicle is outside of the Earth's atmosphere.
The shape of the fairing contributes to Falcon 9's overall efficiency, helping to reduce drag during flight. Once in space, the two fairing halves separate and fall back to Earth, where they will be recovered by our recovery vessel, Go Beyond, to be refurbished and reused on future flights. Both halves of this fairing are flight-proven, with one side flying for its 20th time and the other for the 7th time.
And within that payload fairing is today's payload stack, which was encapsulated just a few days ago. And there you can see a photo from midway through that operation just before the fairing halves were closed in preparation for flight. And right below the fairing is the Falcon 9 second stage, which houses a single Merlin vacuum engine, or what we call the MVAC engine. And below that is the second stage. Below the second stage is the black carbon fiber inner stage, and inside of that inner stage is where the MVAC engine is located.
The inner stage connects the two stages and houses the center pusher that allows the first and second stage to separate during
suppressing
flight.
for strongback retract.
So the truss structure next to the vehicle is known as the strongback, and that's going to start to retract. So we're likely not going to be able to see the retract happen. Below that, we have the first stage, which we usually refer to as the booster.
Strongback retract has started.
The first stage makes up the bottom 2/3 of the vehicle and has 9 Merlin 1D engines at the bottom. Those 9 Merlin engines generate more than 1.7 million pounds of thrust. The first stage supporting today's mission will be making its 26th flight today, having previously launched 5 NRL missions, SARA-1, SWAT, Transporter 8 and 9, Bandwagon 2, and 15 Starlink missions.
About 2.5 minutes into flight, the first stage will separate and make its way back down to Earth. Today's scheduled landing is on our drone ship, Of Course I Still Love You, which there you can see on your screen, currently stationed in the Pacific Ocean.
At T-minus 3 minutes and 37 seconds, all systems are currently a go for an on-time liftoff.
Rideshare missions like today's significantly increase access to space for small satellite operators around the world, and we're excited to be able to offer these launch opportunities for our customers. In addition to helping drive down the cost of access to space by flying reusable vehicles, dedicated rideshare flights provide small satellite operators competitive pricing, increased flight opportunities, and flexibility.
As the demand for rideshare missions has continued to rise, our rideshare program was expanded to accommodate even more small sats looking for rides to orbit. Falcon 9 launched its second Bandwagon mission last year, Bandwagon 2, a separate
Stage
line
1 lock float is complete.
There's a good call out there. So Bandwagon 2 was a separate line of rideshare missions to deliver spacecraft to mid-inclination orbit, rather than to transporters' sun synchronous orbit, and Bandwagon 3 earlier this year in April. Mid-inclined orbits are appealing to a growing number of customers, especially to remote sensing companies that want to strengthen their coverage over areas like parts of Asia and the Middle East.
For more information on these and opportunities to other orbits, visit spacex.com/rideshares.
And with that, we're proceeding into the last few minutes of terminal count. For our next major milestone, we're waiting for that call out of second stage LOX loading completion.
Stage 2 lock float is complete.
There it is. The first and second stages are now fully loaded with over 1 million pounds of rocket-grade kerosene fuel and liquid oxygen. And while it is pretty cloudy today, you can see the white clouds forming around the vehicle on our launch pad right now. This is totally normal. Those clouds are made up of chilled gas from above the surface of the LOX tank that is vented overboard
Gas close-up.
to maintain pressure in the tanks as needed. And when that vented oxygen mixes with the warmer California air outside, it condenses into those clouds that you're seeing. So we're standing by now for confirmation that Falcon 9 is in startup at the T-minus 1 minute mark.
Falcon 9 is in startup.
Good call out there. Falcon 9 is in startup. That means the internal flight computers have taken over the launch countdown. We're now just waiting for the final call from the launch director.
LD is go for launch.
And great news there. All systems are go for launch of Transporter 14.
T minus 30 seconds. T minus 15 seconds. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ignition. And liftoff of Falcon 9. Go SpaceX, go Transporter 14.
Vehicle switching downrange.
M1D chamber pressure is nominal.
We are T plus 40 seconds into flight. Falcon 9 has successfully cleared the tower and cleared the fog. We've got a
Power
great view
and telemetry
there.
nominal.
After lifting off from Space Launch Complex 4 East at Vandenberg Space Force Base in California. We are now currently throttling down to prepare for max Q. That's the point of maximum aerodynamic stresses on the vehicle. Max Q is reached when the air density of the atmosphere decreases faster than the increasing speed of the rocket. We're coming up on max Q here in a few seconds.
Max Q.
And there we've passed through max Q.
Coming up next, we'll have several events happening in quick succession, starting with MECO, followed by stage separation, SES-1, and then the boost back burn. Main engine cutoff, or MECO, is where all 9 Merlin 1D engines shut down to slow the vehicle down in preparation for stage separation, which is where the first stage separates from the second stage.
Started.
Then the MVAC engine on the second stage will light, which is called out as Second Engine Start 1, or SES-1. This engine burn, lasting several minutes, will propel the second stage and the payload to orbit. The boost back burn will then assist the first stage in returning to its recovery location on our drone ship, Of Course I Still Love You. Then the fairing will jettison from the second stage, as it's no longer needed to protect the payloads once we are in space. Later, those fairing halves will separate about 30 seconds after SES-1, so keep an eye out for all of those events coming up shortly.
MECO. Stage separation confirmed. Evacuation.
And there we've had MECO stage separation. On your right-hand screen, you can see the MVAC engine igniting. On your left-hand screen, you can see the grid fins deploying on the first stage, which will soon make its way back down to Earth for a landing on Of Course I Still Love You. Coming up next will be fairing deploy in a few seconds here.
Fairing separation confirmed.
Great call out and great live view of fairing separation.
And as a reminder, those fairings will make their way back to Earth for recovery. The next major milestone coming up is entry burn on our Falcon 9 first stage, which is scheduled to occur around the T plus 6 minute mark. The entry burn is used to slow the first stage as it heads back towards our drone ship, Of Course I Still Love You.
Vehicles are on a nominal trajectory.
We had some good callouts that both vehicles, both first and second stage, are on nominal trajectories. And we are currently in our first MVAC burn, and this burn should last another few minutes. And the next milestone coming up for the first stage will be the entry burn, coming up in about 2 minutes from now. Today's Falcon 9 will be performing a couple more burns to make its way to the drone ship, Of Course I Still Love You, the next up being the entry burn, and then followed by the landing burn.
The first burn, known as the entry burn, slows the vehicle down before hitting the denser parts of Earth's atmosphere. Without this burn, we'd only be using the atmospheric drag to slow down Falcon 9, which would add extra stress to the vehicle. Following entry burn, the booster will initiate the landing burn, which should slow the vehicle down even more for a successful landing. Those white puffs that you see coming off of Falcon 9 are cold nitrogen gas, which helps with attitude control.
Just under a minute away from that entry burn beginning. And again, you can see on your left-hand screen a view from the first stage vehicle as it makes its way back down to Earth. On our right-hand screen is the second stage, looking at the MVAC engine there, still burning. We have a couple more minutes burning on that engine until the first SECO, which is the second stage engine shutdown. Just about 10 seconds away from that entry burn on that first stage. The first stage is just using its grid fins at the moment to help guide its way back to the drone ship, and this entry burn will help slow down the vehicle.
Stage 1 entry burn startup. Stage 1 STS has safed.
There's that call out, and you can see on your screen that the engines have ignited on the first stage vehicle. This should just last about 15 seconds for this burn.
Stage 1 entry burn shutdown.
And you heard that call out, as well as saw that the engines have cut off on the first stage vehicle, ending the entry burn for the first stage today. As mentioned earlier, we are scheduled to land on our drone ship, Of Course I Still Love You, and this would be the 26th flight and landing for this specific booster.
And during the landing burn, we are expecting the shutdown of the second stage MVAC engine. This is known as Second Engine Cutoff 1 or SECO 1. We are about 30 seconds
Stage
away
1
from
transonic.
about 30 seconds away from the landing burn.
Stage 2 internal guidance.
Stage 1 landing burn. Stage 2 FTS has safed.
And there you just heard that call out for the landing burn start on the Falcon 9 first stage. Again, this is the final burn that this booster will execute before touching down.
Stage 1 landing leg deployed. SECO. Stage 1 landing confirmed.
Nominal parking orbit.
And there you just watched as Falcon 9 touched down on Of Course I Still Love You, marking the 26th landing of this booster. We also had SECO 1, which is second stage engine cutoff. Coming up next, we have the second burn of our MVAC engine on board the second stage, or SES-2, and that'll happen around T plus 51 minutes. And we did confirm that we did get a good nominal insertion.
Before we head into a coast, we want to celebrate the Falcon program on recently reaching 500 completed missions. Over the last 17 years, these 500 Falcon missions have restored human spaceflight to the United States, built the Starlink low Earth orbit constellation to provide low latency, high bandwidth communications from orbit, and with recovery and reuse, has radically reshaped the spaceflight industry, making the impossible possible on the road to rapidly reusable rockets. Go Falcon and go SpaceX.
3, 2, 1.
First privately developed launch vehicle to reach Earth orbit from the ground.
And liftoff of the SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket.
The Falcon has landed. Copy, Dragon is in orbit.
Dragon, we're go for launch. Let's light this candle.
Vehicle is in startup.
T-minus 30 seconds. Rock, verify range, go.
Range green.
10.
My computer's in control of the vehicle.
9.
Launch directors, go for launch.
8. 7. LD, verify, go for launch. 6. 5. 4. 3. 2. 1.
Congrats again to our SpaceX team. What an incredible ride it's been together. We're expecting now our first batch of deployments to begin today at about T plus 54 minutes. We'll be back at about T plus 50 minutes to bring you live coverage of SES-2. Until then, enjoy our new space tracks, and we'll see you soon. Welcome back to our live coverage of the Transporter 14 mission. It's been a great launch and overall mission so far.
That's right, Tyler. We've had an on-time liftoff at 2:25 p.m. Pacific time. We recovered the first stage on our drone ship, Of Course I Still Love You, which was its 26th launch and landing for this booster. And we also had a successful first burn of the MVAC engine on our second stage. Now coming up next will be, and followed by a good coast phase, which entered about a 40-minute coast phase.
We're expecting the second ignition of our Merlin vacuum or MVAC engine here shortly, followed by our first batch of payload deployments. If you're just joining us, today's flight is part of SpaceX's Rideshare program. Our Rideshare missions launch multiple small satellites into orbit using a single Falcon 9 rocket.
Nominal orbit insertion.
And we just had ignition of our second stage engine. We had SES-2 followed by SECO-2 and a confirmation of good orbital insertion. Now with that burn complete, we are on track to start our first wave of payload deployments in just a few minutes. And there you can see on your screen some of those payloads attached to the Falcon 9 second stage.
Now, as a reminder, today we are sending 70 payloads to orbit, including CubeSats, microsats, reentry capsules, and orbital transfer vehicles, carrying 3 of those payloads to be deployed at a later time. There will be a total of 66 separate deployment events today, and for this first batch, we're expecting 30 separate deployments.
These will individually separate from Falcon 9's second stage, one right after another, and we should hear callouts as the payloads are deployed. Additionally, we are expecting to have live views for most of these deployments today, and the first deployment sequence will begin with Quick 3, manifested by Exolaunch, and will conclude with Dragoon, manifested by York Space Systems.
So we're expecting the first of those deployments in just under a minute and a half.
If you're just now joining us, you are watching the Transporter 14 mission. This mission carries several payloads for multiple customers today, and we should have some live views. We are expecting payload deployments to start in about 45 seconds from now, and there you can see a live view on our second stage looking forward at our payloads. You're going to see some different views and some different payloads still attached to Falcon 9's second stage. Again, we will begin deployments in about 30 seconds or so, and they will be one right after another, so we should get some really cool live views of each of these CubeSats, microsats deploying here shortly.
Quick 3, separation confirmed.
And we just heard confirmation of Quick 3 separation beginning
Connector
our payload deploys.
IoT-10, separation confirmed. Connector IoT-11, separation confirmed. Mobius 1, separation confirmed. UND Roads 1, separation confirmed. Connector IoT-12, separation confirmed.
Good Ancestor Kila Kila and Ridusat, separation confirmed. Jack 001, separation confirmed. Hyperfield 1B, separation confirmed. TPA1, separation confirmed. Pierre, separation confirmed. Doothsat 2, separation confirmed. Satmar, separation confirmed. Connector IoT9, separation confirmed. Autopup 2, separation confirmed. BRO18, separation confirmed. Valme, separation confirmed. UND Roads 2, separation confirmed. Fossasat 21, separation confirmed. Arkstone, separation confirmed. Ion SCV Passionate Polar, separation confirmed. IOD2 Startical, separation confirmed. Forge Star 1, separation confirmed. MMS1, separation confirmed. Horus 1, separation confirmed. RS2, separation confirmed. Constella Sky B2, separation confirmed. Varda's W4, separation confirmed. Pulsar IOV, separation confirmed.
It's your great call out so far for those payload deployments. We've now got just 2 minutes until the final payload for this deployment sequence.
And we did get some cool views of some of those CubeSats and microsats being deployed there. We should be able to see more during the rest of this mission. And as Tyler mentioned, we are just under a couple minutes away from the last payload deployment in this batch. There's going to be 3 batches, so we're still in the first batch of deployments and have 1 more deployment to go. Once again, if you're just now joining, you are watching the Transporter 14 mission. We're currently in the first batch of deployments of 3. We've deployed 29 payloads so far. We do have 1 more to go coming up
Dragoon,
here.
separation confirmed. All payloads in the first deploy event successfully separated.
And great timing. That confirms the first batch of payload deployments is now complete.
Next up, we are going to coast until the 3rd MVAC relight, or STS-3, which should occur at about T plus 1 hour and 41 minutes. Until then, enjoy the space views and the space jams.
Welcome back to our live coverage of the Transporter 14 mission. If you're just joining us, we're continuing to have a great mission so far. Just to recap, we had an on-time liftoff at 2:25 p.m. Pacific time, recovered our Falcon 9 booster for its 26th landing, and we've completed 2 separate second stage burns so far.
We also saw the first deployment sequence of 30 payloads, and we now have 36 more to go. Coming up shortly is the second relight of our second stage Merlin vacuum engine for a roughly 1 second burn. There's our live view.
We are just under 2 minutes away from that expected SES 3 or second stage engine start 3. That is going to be the third burn of the 5 that we have planned for tonight's mission. And there you can see on your screen a view looking aft on our second stage vehicle, looking at the MVAC engine. Not currently ignited, we're currently coasting. Again, SES 3 is coming up here in about a minute or so. And we'll burn for just about a second. Very quick burn for the second stage. If you're just now joining us, we are waiting for SES 3 coming up here in about 30 seconds. Just patiently waiting for that third burn of this MVAC engine on the second stage.
MVAC ignition. Shutdown.
Nominal parking orbit.
And that's confirmation of a good orbit following our third burn of the MVAC engine on the Falcon 9 second stage. And with that call out, we're now going to take one more break before a fourth second stage engine burn, followed by the second batch of payload deployments beginning at about T+2 hours and 16 minutes.
We'll come back just before the third relight of the MVAC engine, which is about 30 minutes from now, and that will occur about 4 minutes before the next deployment sequence. Enjoy some more of those space jams, and we'll see you then. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our live coverage of the Transporter 14 mission. We're currently just about a minute away or so from the third relight of our Merlin vacuum engine on the Falcon 9 second stage, which is also known as SES-4, second stage engine start 4. And once that short burn, which is going to last just about 1 second, once that short burn completes, it'll be followed by the next batch of payload deployments.
As a reminder, today we are delivering 70 payloads across 66 deployments. We already have deployed in the first batch of 30, and now we have 36 left to go. There will be 35 deployments in this round, and our final deployment will come after a short break. For now, let's stand by for SES-4 and SECO-4 callouts happening shortly.
And we are expecting to have live views. We don't have live views just this moment, so you can follow along with our map on the screen for the Stage 2 trajectory. But we are expecting to gain live views again just before SES-4.
Nominal orbit insertion.
And there we heard that confirmation of nominal orbit insertion. Next deploy should come in about 3 minutes. In case you're just tuning in, we had an on-time liftoff at 2:25 p.m. Pacific time and recovered our Falcon 9 booster for its 26th landing. After the first batch of payload deployments, the second stage had its third successful ignition, and you just saw that fourth MVAC ignition and cut off. So we're now standing by for the next wave of payload deployments. As mentioned earlier, a full list of the payloads on tonight's mission is available on spacex.com/launches. In case you're not familiar, our transporter missions are dedicated rideshare flights to sun-synchronous orbit. SpaceX's rideshare program was expanded to accommodate even more small sats looking for rides to orbit. Falcon 9 is also launching the bandwagon missions, which are a separate line of rideshare missions that deliver spacecraft to mid-inclination orbit rather than to transporter sun-synchronous orbit.
And as a reminder, we have 36 unique deployment events that'll begin in just a little over a minute from now. These will individually separate from Falcon 9's second stage, one right after another, and we should hear callouts for each of these over the nets as they are deployed. And again, we are expecting to have live views just as we do right now, which you are seeing from the Falcon 9 second stage, looking forward at the payloads attached to the payload adapter there on your screen. So hoping to have great views of these deployments. Again, coming up in about 40 seconds or so, we'll begin the second batch of payload deployments for this mission. We are expecting payload deployments to begin for the second batch in about 5 seconds or so. We're going to stand by, listen, and watch as these payloads deploy.
Stitch deploy confirmed. Padre deploy confirmed.
ADDQ deploy confirmed. Lemur 2 Krish deploy confirmed. Satoru T3 deploy confirmed. Shaggy deploy confirmed. Peruse T2 deploy confirmed. A3VA deploy confirmed. Lilo deploy confirmed. Bifrost deploy confirmed. Time Flies deploy confirmed. A2A deploy confirmed. Arviker 2 deploy confirmed. Arviker 3 deploy confirmed. Lemur 2 Zhejiang 2 deploy confirmed. Scooby deploy confirmed. Heo 8 deploy confirmed. Heo 2 deploy confirmed.
Heo 3 deploy confirmed. Eyesight 2 deploy confirmed. Eyesight 3 deploy confirmed. Heo 9 deploy confirmed. Heo 5 deploy confirmed. Eyesight 1 deploy confirmed. Acadia 7 deploy confirmed. Heo 4 deploy confirmed. MuSat 3 deploy confirmed. Eyesight 5 deploy confirmed. Ion SCV Charismatic Carless deploy confirmed. ISI-4 deploy confirmed. YAM-10 deploy confirmed. GRUS-3 deploy confirmed. HEO-6 deploy confirmed.
Lyra-3 separation confirmed.
We're currently still in the second batch of deployments for this mission today for Transporter 14. We are waiting one more payload deploy for this batch to be completed. We are expecting that in just about a minute from now. So far, we have deployed 64 payloads. We are expecting to deliver 70 payloads today. Again, currently in the second batch of 3 batches for today's mission. Again, we got some good live views looking forward at the payload adapter. We still have a few more payloads attached as we're working through the Transporter 14 mission today.
ISI-6 deploy confirmed. All payloads in second separation event have successfully separated.
And with that 65th deployment, we have just over 15 minutes before the Merlin vacuum engine on the second stage restarts for a short deorbit burn. After that, our final payload will separate from the second stage. This is a little bit different from most launches. Typically, the deorbit burn is performed after the last payload is deployed. Our final payload for today, Mission Possible, is a re-entry capsule. So it will deploy after the deorbit burn, which will enable it to re-enter and splash down on a similar trajectory as Falcon 9's second stage. The exploration company's capsule is carrying 25 client payloads to orbit before performing that controlled atmospheric re-entry and splashdown. The demonstration will validate critical systems such as propulsion, avionics, re-entry aerodynamics, thermal protection, and maritime recovery. And we should see the deorbit burn and deployment of Mission Possible right after the break, so stay tuned. We'll see you back here in about 10 minutes at T plus 2 hours and 38 minutes.
And we are back for the conclusion of SpaceX's Transporter 14 mission. Before the break, we saw the second batch of payloads deployed, which had 35 in that group, and now we are waiting for the second stage Merlin vacuum engine to perform a deorbit burn, and that should happen less than 1 minute from now. It's a short burn. It'll last just 5 seconds before shutdown.
And this will be the fifth burn, technically, for this mission. As we mentioned earlier before the break, this is a little bit different from most launches. We typically complete the deorbit burn before the last payload is deployed, but today our final payload, Mission Possible, is a re-entry capsule. So the deorbit burn will occur prior to payload deploy, and it will enable it to re-enter and splash down on a similar trajectory as Falcon 9's second stage. And after the deorbit burn, that final payload deployment should occur at about T plus 2 hours and 43 minutes. So we do have a few minutes before that payload deploy, and we have the deorbit burn coming up here in just about a minute from now. Now we are coming up on that deorbit burn here in a few seconds. And you just saw on your screen the
nominal deorbit burn.
Just saw on your screen and just heard that call out. The deorbit burn performed on the MVAC engine call out was nominal. That is the 5th and final burn for the Transporter 14 mission. Now we have our last payload deployment coming up in just under 3 minutes from now.
This upcoming deployment will be for the Mission Possible deploy. It is the Exploration Company's second space capsule prototype. This capsule is carrying 25 client payloads into orbit before performing a controlled atmospheric re-entry and splashdown. This was developed in just under 3 years, and it's going to include 5 operational phases. First, we're going to have on-orbit payload operations while the capsule remained attached to the Falcon 9 upper stage. Then we're going to have attitude control and stabilization following separation from Falcon 9. Then we'll have autonomous atmospheric re-entry guided by the onboard flight software and the GNC system, and reaching peak temperatures of approximately 2,000 degrees Celsius. Afterwards, we'll have dual-stage parachute deployment and ocean splashdown, at which point there will be a capsule recovery at sea, and the payloads will be returned to Europe. This demonstration will validate critical systems such as propulsion, avionics, re-entry aerodynamics, thermal protection, and maritime recovery.
Again, we are just about a minute away from the Mission Possible deployment. If you're just now joining, we had an on-time liftoff at 2:25 p.m. Pacific time and recovered our Falcon 9 booster for its 26th launch and landing. Today we are sending 70 payloads to orbit, including CubeSats, microsats, re-entry capsules, and orbital transfer vehicles, carrying 3 of those payloads to be deployed at a later time. And we are through 2 of 3 batches of deployments. Again, we are awaiting the final deployment, the Mission Possible capsule, coming up here in about 20 seconds.
Mission Possible capsule deploy confirmed.
And with that confirmation, we have successfully deployed all Transporter 14 payloads. The Mission Possible capsule is now on its way to complete its mission. What an incredible mission today. We would like to thank all of our Rideshare customers for entrusting us with their spacecraft today. Just to recap, that was 70 payloads across 66 unique deployment events.
We also want to say thank you to the Range and Federal Aviation Administration for their support, and to you, our viewers. As a reminder, this launch marks our 17th Rideshare program launch, including both transporter and bandwagon missions. To date, SpaceX has launched more than 1,200 payloads to orbit for more than 130 customers across our entire Rideshare program.
A full listing of today's payloads can be found over at spacex.com/launches. And for more launch coverage, be sure to check that same site for the most up-to-date information, or follow us at SpaceX on X. And with that, we'll be bringing our webcast to an end. Thank you again for joining us today.